In this lesson, we'll create a feature pattern. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to create a circular feature pattern and create a rectangular feature pattern. We're going to carry on with our locking plate file in Fusion 360. We've already applied fillets to the model, and now we want to explore something called feature patterns. So in order to do this, we first need to identify what's going to get patterned. So in our case, remember, if we select faces that belong to a feature, that feature will get highlighted in the timeline. So first we have extrude 3, we have our fillet, we have extrude 5, and then over here we have this extra feature that's on top, which is part of extrude 5. And if we roll back, we have extrude 4 being right in the middle, and extrude 2 being the main boss. So we want to pattern extrude 2, 3, 5, as well as this fillet feature. In order to do this, let's start by going to our Create dropdown, and we're going to go to our Pattern submenu and select Circular Pattern. When we use Circular Pattern, there are many different ways in which we can use it. We can pattern faces, bodies, features, and components. Faces can be a helpful option, especially if using features tends to fail on complex geometry. But for our purposes, we're going to start with features. We need to select the features, and in our case, again, we're going to go to the timeline, selecting extrude 2, extrude 3, extrude 5, as well as the fillet. The next thing that we need to define is the axis of revolution. This can be a cylindrical edge or an axis. Keep in mind that if we're selecting a partial edge, it will affect the amount in which each of these is going to be spaced. So I suggest using a full circular edge or using an axis of revolution. Once on the screen, notice again that we have manipulators, there are some checkboxes, as well as this small menu in which we can enter parameters. The on-screen manipulator allows us to drag it left and right towards plus and minus and add or remove a number of features. The checkboxes allow us to suppress certain features. The option seen here, suppress, is the checkbox, and if we deselect that, we're not able to suppress any of them. The quantity is going to be the number of instances, including the original. So you can see here that we have an adjusted set of 4, including the original, using a full type. If we set this to angle, we can define it as, in this case, 180 degrees, and patterning 4 within that area. For our purposes, we're going to use the full option, but just note there are several other ways. Also, there are compute options. Right now, it's set to adjust. There's also identical and optimized. For our specific example, these 3 options are going to produce the exact same result. However, if you're patterning features or specific geometry across variable geometry, meaning that the location in which the pattern is going may or may not be the same as the seed or the original, then some of these options will really be needed in order to take things like a pocket through a section of a body that is thicker than the original. So for us, again, the compute options aren't going to make a difference, but if you're having trouble with a tricky feature, make sure that you explore some of those compute options. From here, we're going to say OK, and note that we now have 4 instances on this pattern. Just like any other feature, we can always go back and make adjustments. Note that if we select geometry on the original, that it takes us back to that extrude feature. However, if we select geometry on one of the patterns, it's going to highlight the pattern feature in the timeline. For our purposes, we also want to explore patterning bodies, and we're going to do that by using the rectangular pattern. Note again that it's in the Create menu, under Patterns, and there is a third option called Pattern on Path. Pattern on Path is a great way to explore using the optimize and adjust options inside of these patterns. But for our purposes, we're going to use rectangular pattern. Again, we can select the type, and in this case, we're going to select bodies. The objects are going to be the body that we want to pattern, and the directions can be selected based on the axes in the default origins folder, or we can use edge selections directly on our part. Either one will be fine, and in this case, I'm going to select the x-axis. Again, we have on-screen manipulators, and if we go to a top view and zoom out, as I begin to drag the manipulator out to the right, notice that we're creating a number of instances. As I drag this one vertically, again, we're creating a number of instances. So now we're patterning these in two different directions, in X and Y. The parameters for that can be controlled on the screen with this pop-up menu, with the manipulators, as well as the parameters inside the dialog. For example, if we increase the number to 4, we can also increase the spacing to 300, and we can modify the second direction as well. Note that each of these also have options, such as symmetric, which works better when we're working on an odd number. For example, if we set this to 5, then we'll have 2 extra instances on either side of the original. Note that this can be controlled in each direction individually. For our purposes, let's go ahead and increase the distance to 450 millimeters, and that gives us a good amount of space between those. Note that there's also a distance type in which we can define the overall or the spacing between. For example, if we want to control the spacing between each, and we set this to, say, 150 millimeters, we can control how far each of these goes. Note that suppress is also an option in here, and if we decide that certain features inside of here don't need to be created, we can remove them by suppressing them. Once we say OK, we've now got additional bodies in this file based on that pattern. I do want to note that there are other options under Create, such as Mirror, which will allow us to mirror solid bodies, faces, and features, just like we did with our pattern. And again, there is a pattern on path that allows us to pattern features, bodies, and components along complex selections. Also, just like any other feature, we are able to select and make modifications to that. For example, if we decided we wanted to bring back those suppressed features, in this case, it's going to bring back 2 extra bodies and then update the file. From here, I'm going to go ahead and save this file, and we won't be using this again in other lessons, so you can continue to play around with it, make adjustments, see how you can make adjustments to the original features, such as going back into that original pattern, maybe making this set to 3, and seeing how all the rest of the features further down in the timeline are going to update. But once you're done, do make sure that you save often. That way you can always go back to older versions if needed, and then once you're done, go ahead and move on to the next lesson.